Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Fossil Friday Chats. Happy Friday. I'm Brittany Stoberg, one of your hosts, coming to you from the Western Science Center. With me, as always, is my co-host, Gabriel Santos from the Raymond and Alf Museum. How you doing, Gabe?
Doing good, doing good. Got the brand new setup today, so let's hopefully we
Yeah.
have no tech issues.
Gabriel has a whole new techie battle station that I'm quite jealous of on his end, and he is making the magic happen for Fossil Friday Chats today, as he does every time we go on the air.
I have 5 screens in front of me right now, and it's the best thing ever.
You must be in techie heaven, just like
It's
so excited.
it's so cool. I wish I could show it.
And joining us today is our guest, Maayan Harel. How are you doing?
Hi, nice to be here. Thank you.
We're super excited to have you on the show today. Like we haven't had very many paleoanthropology type talks, but to have yours plus a paleo art thing, I'm gonna be just here taking notes. Like, oh, so cool.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is going to be a pretty unique Fossil Friday Chats. When we booked you, I was very excited for your topic, and like Gabriel said, it's we don't often get to feature paleo artists or paleoanthropologists, and having the combo is going to be really cool.
Yeah, I'm not a paleo. I'm not a. Sorry, it's not my scientific field. I'm a science artist, right? So I'm definitely like on the paleo art side of things. But yeah, I'm really excited. And I think also from watching the other Fossil Fridays, seeing so much amazing paleo art, I think it's kind of, I don't know. I'm kind of happy to like talk a little bit about reconstruction art and stuff like that.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you're not familiar with Maayan's work, Maayan Harel is a scientific artist with a background in geosciences. She trained at the Science Illustration program at CSUMB and has an M.Sc in atmospheric science from Tel Aviv University. Her work has appeared on the covers of leading scientific journals and also runs workshops to help scientists use visuals to communicate their work. So I'm guessing that at least some of our Fossil Friday Chats viewers have come across your work at some point.
That's probably the case. Probably actually the piece that I'm going to be talking about a lot today is probably the one that's been most widely seen. But yeah, so that's exciting.
Awesome. And as always, everybody, if you have questions for Maayan, go ahead and put those in the chat. We'll have a Q&A portion after her lecture, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Great. So thank you for the introduction. As I said, I'm a science illustrator, and the title of my talk is What Did They Look Like? But I'm actually going to start a little bit with some background about myself and kind of how I got into this. So I've always been fascinated by the natural world. And also as a kid, I really liked writing stories and illustrating. And I actually ended up going to an arts-focused middle school and high school. But when it came time for me to kind of study at university, I was really considering going down this artistic path, but I just was curious about too many things. And I actually kind of left art behind for a few years and ended up going to university at a large school at Tel Aviv University and getting a double degree in geosciences and political science. I also worked as a research assistant and eventually went on to do a master's in atmospheric science. And I was studying things like how thunderstorm activity has changed over Africa from the 1950s on. And I was kind of debating what I should do because at this point I really knew I wanted to be involved in science communication, but I wasn't sure if becoming a scientist was kind of the right way to go about that for me. And I heard from a friend about science illustration as a career, and it seemed like it could be a good fit. And so I kind of got a little bit back into art and made a portfolio and was accepted at the California State University, Monterey Bay Science Illustration Graduate Program. And that was a lot of fun. So that's, gave me the opportunity to work with specimens and do field sketching and even learn a bit about forensic reconstruction. So from there, I actually went on to do some internships and hone my skills. And I was really fortunate. I got to intern at the Smithsonian, at the Museum of Natural History in DC, and also at the Tropical Research Institute. And I also got to intern at National Geographic magazine. And actually here on the right, you can see a photo of me with Wilma. So Wilma is an amazing Neanderthal sculpture by Kennis and Kennis, who actually lives at the Nat Geo headquarters. And I also have spent 2 years working at the Los Angeles Zoo, mostly illustrating birds. But these days I run a small independent studio known as Maayan Visuals. And I work in collaboration with a couple of other artists, and really I specialize mostly in working with scientists to illustrate figures for publication, sometimes some popular science books and cover art for journals, things like that. And in 2017, I was asked by the Carmel Lab at Hebrew University to start working on illustrations of Denisovan humans. And this is kind of a project that I worked on really slowly in like small pieces over the course of nearly 2 years. So I'm here today to tell you about that, but I'm going to start by giving some background about the science, because in this case, the research is very deeply connected to the artwork, and I think you'll see what I mean by that. But you can see from this timeline from National Geographic that despite the relatively short history of Homo sapiens, our species, like on this planet, which is less than 500,000 years old, we really evolved alongside and shared the Earth, in some locations at least, with other species of humans. And the research in paleoanthropology has really been undergoing kind of a revolution over the past decade or so. And that's due to the development of faster and more advanced methods of working with ancient DNA and DNA in general. And these advancements have enabled some phenomenal discoveries. So one place that's had some amazing findings is Denisova Cave. So this is a cave that's located in Russia, in Siberia, in the Altai Mountains. And it's a region that's actually thought to have been inhabited both by Neanderthals and by what I'm going to be calling modern humans. Okay, modern humans is us for the purposes of this discussion. So this region was inhabited by both species. And in 2008, diggers in Denisova found a tiny, tiny fragment of a finger bone, a pinky really, which belonged to a young girl who lived about 70,000 years ago. And the bone had preserved enough mitochondrial DNA that it could be analyzed. And this was done in the lab of Svante Pabo. So Svante Pabo just this week, I feel like my timing is very good, because just this week, Svante Pabo was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work with ancient DNA. So he sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and he made this amazing discovery of the mitochondrial DNA in the bone sample. So when they were analyzing this sample, they found that this girl wasn't a modern human. She wasn't a Homo sapien. She also wasn't a Neanderthal. So she had to be something different. And they since called this the Denisovan hominin. And later on, the nuclear genome was also sequenced by David Reich. But a couple of years later, another finding emerged from the cave, and that's this unusually large molar. And that was also confirmed to be Denisovan, but not from the same girl, not from the same individual. And in general, there have been a couple of locations where there have been findings of these large molars, which were confirmed to be Denisovan. And there were also, though, some findings that we're going to call possible or suspected Denisovans. So these are fossils that, due to either their geography, their dating, or their features, were considered, possibly Denisovan. For example, there are the Shuchang skulls found in China, and these were published in 2017. And these are really interesting skulls because they had some features that were similar to earlier Eastern Eurasian humans. Some were more similar to what I'm going to be calling modern humans, right, to us. And some were more similar to Neanderthals. But without DNA evidence, there was no way to confirm if these are, in fact, Denisovan skulls. So this is really intriguing. And these discoveries kind of present a dilemma because this is a new situation. Usually when a new species is discovered, it involves a holotype, a first finding. So for example, this is Neanderthal 1, Feldhofer, discovered in 1856. But the discovery of Denisovans was made in a lab, and initially with no fossils besides this tiny bone fragment. And then we had this molar. So how do we describe something if its defining feature is its DNA? So really, this is kind of an attempt to answer that question. And the Carmel Lab was trying to figure out how to get anatomical information from DNA. This is Dr. Komen on the right. And in 2017, David Gochman, who at the time was a PhD student in the lab, told me about how they were trying to learn about the Denisovan anatomy. So their idea was to compare the epigenetic information of species whose anatomy is known to the Denisovan DNA. And if I'm looking at these three species, they took Neanderthals, modern humans, and chimpanzees. All of these three we have anatomical information for, right? We know what they look like. but we also have their DNA sequence, and we know what their DNA code is. And when it comes to inherited traits or features, we would say that a gene or a genotype codes for a phenotype. Phenotype means a trait or a feature. And we often hear things like we share large percentages of our DNA code with other species, and that's true. But it's important to understand that the DNA code alone is not the only thing that determines our features. So DNA code is what we call genetics. But epigenetics play a role as well. Epigenetics are heritable changes, so changes that can pass from parent to child that don't change the DNA sequence, but they can affect our traits. So these can occur due to things like the external or environmental factors, but they can also be a part of just normal development. And one example of an epigenetic change called methylation. So this is a chemical change. So what happens is methyl groups, which you see here in the glowing kind of white balls, they can get added on to the DNA molecule. And in the place that that happens, it can actually turn off that specific gene. So the Carmel lab wasn't really looking at the genetic code on its own. What they were looking at is the methylation pattern, the sort of patterns of these methyl groups on the DNA strand. And they were comparing that between different species. And combining those comparisons with the information of what we know about specific genes and the type of traits they code for allowed them to kind of get information about Denisovan anatomical traits. Some Denisovan anatomical traits. So their result was really kind of a list of traits. And they tested their method on chimpanzees and Neanderthals to see how well it worked. And it came out that it was about 85% accurate in predicting general anatomical traits. And then they used their method on the Denisovan genome. So we got this list of traits about the Denisovan, kind of a spreadsheet of traits. And in this case, I was kind of the sketch artist trying to figure out what to make of these. They called it an identikit. So here's just an example of what this might have looked like, or this is one of them. You have here sort of Denisovan versus modern human and Denisovan versus Neanderthal. So all of the information was in the form of a comparison. So under Denisovan versus modern human, as one example, they found Denisovan would have a larger pelvis than a modern human, or than us. But under Denisovan versus Neanderthal, they found no difference in the size of the pelvis. So they would predict that it would have the same size pelvis as a Neanderthal. And based on these lists, I was asked to make illustrations of the skull, the skeleton, and finally a face. But my first step really needed to be thinking about what's the process. How do I get from A to B? What are my visual references? So paleo artists, we often have this idea of this problem of how do I illustrate something that's not known? And a good way to approach this is to turn to one of the closest relatives as a point of reference. And Denisovans are most closely related to Neanderthals, followed by us. But then we also had these suspected Denisovans. So what was I going to do about those? So when I was told about the project, I was told about these as well. And because my job was illustrating the results of the study, using these skulls as references was really off the table because to do so could compromise the process. And so those skulls were left out of my references on purpose. And some of the lab mates were actually curious to see if my illustration would resemble these. So instead, I had to be limited to the species used in the study. And because all of the information was in the form of a comparison, we decided that the illustration should also be a comparison. So the first step needed to be illustrating skulls of modern humans and Neanderthals. And this would give me a better understanding of the anatomy and how to adjust the different traits for the Denisovan model. And another thing that's really important here is that the results of the study aren't meant to show how the difference between one Neanderthal specifically and one Denisovan, but rather they're trying to find what traits define the category, what makes Denisovan a Denisovan and a Neanderthal, and us. And so for these purposes, we aren't really interested in how one Denisovan looked, but what are the traits that define the category? So because most standard literature uses adult males, we decided we would do an adult male Denisovan too, for comparisons purposes. So for drawing the modern human skull, there's a lot of kind of medical textbooks and things like that. But when it came to Neanderthals, this was actually a little bit trickier. And because it needed to be not one single Neanderthal, but a Neanderthal that could represent all Neanderthals, there were kind of two fossil skulls that we turned to. And these are considered like the most complete, the most representative of Neanderthal anatomy, kind of the classics. And those are Shanidar and the Old Man of La Chapelle au Centre. And even so, even working with just these two, because each one is really an individual, it actually proved to be quite difficult. So you can see here in an early sketch how my illustration of the Neanderthal really changed as I was working with the different specimens. And in the end, I turned to another one of the collaborators on the team. This is Dr. Yoel Rak. He's an anatomist. He's actually an expert on Neanderthal skull anatomy. And Dr. Rak was very, very generous with his time, and he even allowed me access to his collections at Tel Aviv University. And that was really helpful. And really his guidance kind of helped to achieve this kind of representative Neanderthal skull that you see here. So when that was complete, it was really time to start working on Denisovan itself. So let's take a look at what we knew, like what was the information at hand when we were working on this. So first we had the fossil record. So the finger bone, the Denisova 3 finger bone, the original finding, is interesting because it indicates, and you can see here on the right, a reconstruction of what they would predict the Denisova 3 whole finger would look like, the kind of tip of the pinky. And it was interesting because it's actually very delicate, very similar to our finger bones. By contrast, Neanderthal finger bones, which you can see on the left, are much bigger. They're much more robust, and it's probably because of the cold climates that they lived in. So we have that. We assume delicate finger bones. But then they also have these oversized molars. And the oversized molars are really interesting because it's pretty well accepted that over evolution, molars have pretty consistently gotten smaller over time. And these large molars are much more similar to more ancient species like Australopithecus or Homo habilis here in this artwork by John Gurche. So this is a really interesting feature because for a fairly recent human species, these molars are really large. And then we also have the results of the study, of course. So let's see what they found. First of all, they found several features that would be expected to be like the Denisovan, or like the Neanderthal. So first they found the face length and forehead height. The base of the skull and the flat top of the Neanderthal skull was also something that they expect with the Denisovan would have. And also things like the jawbone and palate size. But they also found several unique features to the Denisovan. The first is a wide skull, wider even than Neanderthal skulls, particularly on the parietal and temporal bones. A large dental arch with large molars, and an enlarged conda, which is the jawbone connects to the skull. And really interestingly, they also expect a facial projection that would fall somewhere between modern humans and Neanderthals. So to explain what I mean by that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Neanderthal facial anatomy for a second. So Neanderthals are famous for having this really, really heavy brow bone, but they also have another unique feature in terms of their facial projection. So this is an illustration by Yoel Rak, who I mentioned previously, and here he's comparing a Neanderthal skull on the left to what he calls kind of a general primate skull structure on the right. So on a chimpanzee or a human general primate skulls, you'll have a flat frontal plane where the eyes sit. But then you have like a 90-degree angle, a sharp corner where the cheekbones fold back. But on a Neanderthal, there's no corner like that. The cheekbones don't fold back. Instead, they project forwards at an angle, and the nasal bone sticks out really far. So it's very likely that Denisovans had huge noses. And actually, Dr. Yoel Rak, the expert in Neanderthal skull anatomy, was saying that most of the issues he sees with a lot of Neanderthal reconstructions is that he thinks that everyone makes the noses too small because we don't really know what their noses looked like, but they were huge, huge noses. So that's kind of, in terms of the Denisovan, that's kind of a good sort of limitations, right? It would have to fall somewhere between those two extremes. So the facial projection needed to be somewhere between this, like our very delicate, like little nasal bone that sticks out from a flat plane versus the Neanderthal that has this huge kind of forward projection. And genetically speaking, though, because Neanderthals and Denisovans are sister groups, our kind of general representative Neanderthal was really useful because it could serve as a baseline for the Denisovan illustration. So what we did is we decided that any trait that was unknown we would decide was like the Denisovan, was like the Neanderthal feature. So that really gave us a jumping off point and allowed that representative skull to be a basis for the Denisovan model. So here you can see, as I started sketching, I accidentally thought that only that top part of the skull needed to be very wide on the Denisovan instead of including kind of the whole further down. So it looks a bit like an alien in my first attempt, but then I kind of reworked it and started smoothing things out. And the other thing we decided was that because, you can see here it coming together, but because the Denisovan is this kind of artificial model, we decided that the illustration should be a little bit more simple when compared to the modern human and Neanderthal, which we illustrated in this very, very like realistic, natural kind of way. And here you can see that sort of medium mid-face projection on the Denisovan. And this is the final artwork as it appeared in the paper, and we highlighted in color all those different features that, that we discussed, like the molars, the cheekbones, the wide skull. And then we followed a really similar process for the skeletons. And interestingly, though, despite what we know about the fossil record, their analysis found that that Denisovans would probably have, you know, large finger bones similar to Neanderthals, but we know that that's not the case from the fossil record. So that's, you know, kind of an interesting finding. On the other hand, though, while I was kind of polishing this final artwork for the paper, there was a new finding that got us really excited. So this is in 2019. The Shahe jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau was discovered, and it was confirmed. It wasn't discovered. It was confirmed to be Denisovan via a new method of protein analysis. And this got us really, really excited because it's this really long and robust jaw with big molars, and it matched our model really well in 7 out of the 8 traits. And as of today, actually, the Harbin skull seems to be the likeliest Denisovan skull to date. And it also matches our model well in many of the features, including things like the wide skull and the low forehead, and that mid-face projection. So this is a reconstruction of the Harbin man by Chang Zhao. But this all came later. And back to kind of my timeline when I was working on this, now that I had a skeletal model, it was really kind of time to move on to a facial reconstruction. And similar to what forensic reconstruction artists do, the idea was to make a portrait that would represent Denisova 3. So that's the girl whose DNA sparked all of these discoveries. And the best estimate of her age is about 13 and a half years old, but this isn't entirely clear. But either way, my first step here needed to be to adapt this adult male Denisovan model into a young female. And again, my best references here were the skulls and reconstructions of Neanderthal children. And these are a couple of examples. The Lakinia child by Kennis and Kennis, and the Devil's Tower reconstruction by Elizabeth Daines. And then we have a skull from the Smithsonian. So one thing that was actually very helpful to know here was that juveniles of different primate species tend to look more similar to each other than the adults do. And that's particularly true on the face. So that was very helpful for me. But to adapt my adult male into a young female, the eyes needed to get bigger. And then pretty much all of the other features, particularly things like the nose and the jawbone, all needed to become more delicate. And initially I thought that this adapted skull could be the basis of my portrait on its own, but I started sketching, and these are some of the early sketches. And I just was kind of feeling dissatisfied. And I really wanted to get this work the attention that I felt it deserved. And so when I was thinking about this problem, one of the images that came to mind is this really famous portrait by Steve McCurry from the 80s from National Geographic. And what was interesting to me about this is that, so this is Sharbat Gula. She has a name. But when I first encountered her, she was this nameless, mysterious girl. She was the Afghan girl. And she's of a similar age to Denisova 3 in the photo. And so even though she was mysterious, she was so arresting. Like I couldn't take my eyes off of her. And that was a really good source of inspiration because I thought that's kind of the closeness that I want. I really wanted eye contact. And I was thinking about how to achieve this. And the idea of sculpting the face actually came from Fernando Baptista. He's a lead artist at National Geographic, and he often uses this technique of sculpting models and then photographing them and using those photographs either as the basis of illustrations or inserted into illustrations and infographics and stuff like that. And it's a really amazing technique. And he was kind enough to talk to me about the process that he uses and offer some guidance along the way. And I started off basically with sculpting the skull. And I used Super Sculpey clay, which is really fun if anyone wants to play with some Super Sculpey. Very fun clay to work with. And then the skull would need to be hardened. So I didn't want to lose my original. So instead I chose to 3D scan and print my skull so I wouldn't have to work over it. Hard eyeballs needed to be inserted. And then I could start with soft tissue reconstruction. So building out muscles, fat pads, and then finally a face. The final sculpture would be photographed, and then I would paint over that digitally. And here is a time lapse just showing some of the process of that original reconstruction. And you can kind of see how over time a face kind of starts to emerge. And because I was imagining her inside a dark cave, I actually put her in a dark closet to photograph her, and then started painting over the top. So when it came to references for her external appearance, there were two main sources of information. The first is that Denisova III likely had dark hair and skin with no freckles. But because we were really aware of the fact that climate has a big impact on melanin and how dark skin gets, we decided that rather than aim for a really deep complexion, we would go for sort of a more medium to dark complexion. And the second source of information has to do with admixture of DNA. So what I mean by that is that we know that there were hybrids. There was interbreeding between Neanderthals and humans, or modern humans, and Denisovans. And as of today, the group with the largest proportion of Denisovan DNA are Melanesians, and some groups of Aboriginal Australians, I think, can have up to 6% of their DNA attributed to the Denisovan genome. So that's a significant amount. That's a lot of mixture of populations relatively. So because of that, images like these of Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian children were also really helpful. So I had two concepts for the final art, but in the end, the one here on the right was selected for the cover of Cell in September of 2019. And, you know, we achieved our goal of impact. And in the end, this image actually ended up getting a lot more press attention than we ever imagined. This is Niran Komel unveiling the statue at a press conference just after the publication. And when I think back on this project, it really did feel as if we were kind of working in somewhat uncharted territory. And of course, hindsight is 2020, but a few things were often misunderstood despite our very best efforts. And this really led me to ask, you know, what could we have done differently? And one thing that came up a lot is that a lot of news outlets misinterpreted the process, and they either spoke about it as some kind of computer generated model or as a direct line from a person's DNA to their appearance. And clearly from the very long process I just described to you, that is not the case. Okay, we're not there. But it did really make me remember this thing, that this concept that I learned as a student in the science illustration program. So my teachers there, Ann Cottle and Jenny Heller, pointed something out that has really kind of come up a lot throughout my career. And it's something that has really stuck with me. When it comes to writing text, an author gets to choose what they want to talk about. What do they want to say? When do they get to stay silent? But to create a complete image, silence is not usually an option. You really kind of have to put something out there. So silence is kind of a luxury that illustrators aren't really afforded in the same way that authors are. And the authors of this book, I think, understand me. But regardless, there are a few kind of takeaways and things that in retrospect I would have done differently. And I'm going to share some of those. So the first has to do with this kind of dark cave image. This dark image caused a lot of problems because it really caused some misinterpretation of skin tone. Because the original image was so dark, even though it was intentional, a lot of the news outlets actually ended up lightening the piece because it was so dark. And what happened was the skin tone appeared much lighter than originally intended. So because of that, these days when I get a usage request, I actually send a color corrected image, which is the one you see here, and I ask users not to lighten it. And I explain the issue with that. The other thing I would do is, if the process is misinterpreted, I would do a better job documenting it. And after all, at one point in the reconstruction, I had so many models on the go at once that my kitchen cabinets looked like this. So the first time you do something, though, it's about learning. And the second time you get to incorporate some lessons. And I was really fortunate. I got another opportunity to illustrate Denisova 3 for a documentary. And then just putting on a clip of the end part of that process. So I had a little bit more filmed, but this is sort of how the painting came together of the new illustration of Denisova 3. And I have a highlights reel of a lot of the process of making this on my Instagram. So if anyone is interested, you're welcome to check that out. And I'm also really pleased that she is currently on display at the City of Science and Industry, which is one of the largest science museums in Europe. So here she is on display in Paris in an exhibition about Denisovans. And I'm really grateful that I get to create art that helps connect us to our story and our evolutionary history. And I hope to be able to continue telling these types of stories. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
So
should I close out my presentation? Sorry.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Did you ever scare yourself when you opened a cabinet and all of a sudden there were just a bunch of skulls in there?
I'm a little immune to. I don't see them as like a pirate ship or anything like that anymore. I'm just like, oh, it's a part of anatomy. It doesn't like read as illness or death or anything like that to me. It's just kind of. So not anymore. No, I don't know. It's just kind of. I don't have that association of skulls anymore. Not even human ones. It's just gone.
I just feel like that's something like when you have guests over, like, oh, just be careful when you open this cabinet if you're going through something.
No, that is true. That is true. And I had to move at some point, and it was just like, oh God, like I have to like remember to clear out the kitchen cabinets.
Oh no.
And not just leave stuff. Yeah.
That'd be quite
it was pretty freaky. I ran out of space. I needed to start using the kitchen for storage.
I think it's super cool that you utilize 3D printing so that you didn't have to like use the original sculpt you made and then you were able to just use it over and over. That's such a cool application of that technique.
I've never thought about that.
The tricky part wasn't the printing. The tricky part was finding a 3D scanner. That was the harder part. It's like finding someone who has a scanner, because 3D printers are a lot of university campuses have them. I ended up using university campus printers and stuff, but yeah, I was like, I really felt like, I'd worked so hard on it. I didn't want to lose it. And it did allow me to use that same skull as the basis for the second illustration too, because, there was nothing to change about the skull really.
Yeah. It probably helped you make it because it's like a solid piece, sort of, right?
Oh yeah. The problem with there is actually a technical problem with using 3D prints. So, I had to ship the sculpture, and that was a problem because I couldn't bake it. So if I had used the Sculpey, I could have baked the Sculpey within the middle. There's like the foil thing. It can see heat, but if you put a 3D printed thing in an oven, that's going to melt. And so I was like, okay, well, I have to send this clay that's not hardened in a FedEx box. It was not pleasant. But I don't know. I think it was worth it. Even though I can't bake them now, I still think like the gain is worth it, especially since the final product is illustrations and, yeah.
No, yeah, the technique you showed is not something I personally had seen before, where you like combine multiple types of like art processes to create this really amazing piece. And I think it's really cool that you're wanting to show that process so that it doesn't get misinterpreted like at the end. I think that's something that happens even in the science part of things and the technical side of things, the media
Sure.
will often misinterpret like what the final message was.
Yeah. No, I really, the amount of times I saw people talking, like I saw just like poor, poor interpretations of it really made me feel like, this is a problem. We can't have people thinking that you're going to make a police sketch, off of this. It's not true. I mean, maybe in the future, and that's scary on its own, but like, that's not where we're at,
Yeah. I do remember seeing that on Twitter once all that stuff was coming out. And my gut instinct initially was like, is that really? I don't know.
Yeah. And it's like the amount of like stages between one and the next, there's so much space between those two things that it's just,
Well, as we saw, like you were saying, science communication is so important so that we can understand that kind of process.
Yeah.
We have a great question from Bailey. She's asking, do you enjoy the sculpting process or the painting process more? How do they complement each other?
So this is interesting because what's really cool about this technique is it does a lot of the painting work for you. So it solves, the reason it's so amazing is it solves all of the issues of like, if you know the structure of something, how does the light hit it? So you can set up the lighting, you take a photograph that you like, and you spend some time taking pictures to get, results that you like. And then the painting process is so much easier because all of that has kind of solved for you. So I really enjoy sculpting. It's really fun. And I do a lot more painting than I do sculpting. So sculpting is more special to me and I really enjoy it. But what is really amazing and like probably the most kind of like amazing moment is when you paint in the eyes, because it like this thing that's very unanimated, that's very waxy, that doesn't look real. As soon as you paint in eyes, even if they're not that great yet, like even if it's just the initial thing, it suddenly becomes alive. It's really crazy. So that's kind of the best part. Like the best moment is painting in the eyes, but I think I enjoy the sculpture, the most. Yeah.
Was sculpting something that you learned as a science in your science illustration program, or is that something you kind of learned on your own beforehand?
Well, I had it in high. I did have like middle school and high school some sculpture. Not a lot of like it wasn't something that I was really spent a lot of time doing. But in science illustration school, we did a little bit. We did forensic reconstruction, and it was also definitely something that was brought up was that, if you need to figure out how the lighting is on something, even if it's not a paleo piece, even if, you just don't have that particular thing and you don't have enough photographs or you don't have a photograph of the specific moment that you want, if you sculpt it and light it, it's really helpful, just not even for photographing, but like if you have something just really simple, not as detailed as this, and you draw from it, it really helps figure out those structures and like how to make something look 3D basically. Yeah. So I don't have a lot of formal sculpture training or anything like that, but but that's kind of touched in. Yeah.
So you have your background originally with your MS in atmospheric science, right?
Yeah.
And then you did the science illustration program. When you're creating art, and it's something that I've asked a lot of other science illustrators before, is how much of the balance is there from the hard science, the facts, with a little bit of the imagination, the artistry that goes to kind of create these visual stories for you as the artist and the scientist?
Yeah, I think something that I really like is reading about the science, like getting to that point where I understand. And I work with a lot, my formal training is geosciences and earth science. I don't have formal biology training, but most of my clients are somewhere in the biology world, even if it's not paleo art. So I kind of have been, when I really enjoy learning basically, because I get to learn about these different fields. So learning kind of what the kind of main takeaway message of that particular sort of bit of science is, and like trying to make it into a visual story is the part I think that I most kind of like, I almost can't not do it. When I was in university, before I went to science illustration school, before I even knew what it was, when I was in undergrad, my notebooks were very sought after. And everyone wanted to copy my notebooks because I tended to do a really good job taking notes, but also like I used to kind of just draw things out just because that's how it makes sense to me. Like not so much drawing, like doing a nice drawing, but just like making a geometric arrangement of whatever information was like being given to me. Cause it's just how my brain works. So I think that part of it is just very like, it's just what my mind wants to do. I don't know how else to like, to say it as soon as I'm actually learning about the science. So I don't know what that, I don't know how that answers it, but that's just how I seem to operate.
No, yeah, that makes sense. I would have loved to have been your friend in college because my notes, you know, I love the color coding and everything, especially when I was in anatomy. I would try to illustrate what I was learning, but it did not look it did not look like what I was trying to learn. So I don't know if it actually helped me, but you know, it did like, you know, getting the visualization and kind of doing it myself forced my brain to make that visual memory, you know?
And I think that there's research about like, I mean, I also went to college, like not, you know, I had a laptop, but I wasn't typing notes, you know, I was handwriting notes. And I personally really believe in that. Like, I really think that there's something that happens when you draw something out for yourself or write it down for yourself. There is some kind of brain hand thing happening, which I believe there's actually research on. I'm not, you know, I'm not sold, but like there is definitely advantages to doing handwriting when you're learning things. And yeah, and I'm really kind of terrified that that's getting lost, honestly, because I think it's so important to like how you process information.
I don't know. My TikTok is full of like those iPad note taker people. And
I mean,
oh man.
I
I
did
guess
that for
on
my
iPad it would
master's.
be
I like
better, right?
that.
But like the typing, I think it's the typing that's like freaky.
I
The
did
writing on an iPad's probably better. Yeah.
I did that for my master's because I would like download the lecture slides, and then I would write on my iPad with them, and that was quite helpful. And it had the same, for me at least, I know at least for me, I don't retain, I always joke at work, I'm like, if you tell me something and I don't write it down, it's gone. Like,
no, I'm like that too. It vanishes.
If
I'm not like doing, it just doesn't stay the same way.
It does not, it is not in my brain anymore. And so I would, writing it down on the iPad seemed to have the same ability to make me memorize it.
That makes sense to me though, because you're doing this like thing.
You're doing an action, like a physical action.
Yeah, exactly. Really important.
I think it comes back around too, because it's like that's the whole point of doing this science illustration, right? It's like you're creating these really accessible visual stories so that folks can learn more about the science. It's like, you know, my mom is not going to read my scientific papers no matter how much I ask her. But when my brother does the scientific illustrations for my publication,
that's awesome.
He, you know, I was able to give that to my mom, and I could like point out things and explain it to her visually, and she was like, "Oh, okay." So yeah. The illustration part, I'm a huge fan of science illustration. You can ask any of our science illustration interns. I think it's so important that like we have this ability to create visual stories.
Yeah, I think it's so great that you guys have so many science illustration interns. I had a very hard time finding internships. Like it took me quite a while to kind of get into like to manage to find internships that would work for me. Yeah.
Dang, you should have called us.
Too early. I know. It took a while. Then they all kind of came in at once, but it really did take me a while to kind of get convince people to take you as an intern. Yeah.
Speaking of Alf Museum scientific illustration art interns, Rob is asking, quote unquote cavemen are also often the butt of jokes. Why do you think putting a face to ancient humans is important to encourage our understanding of how they lived?
Oh, this is so interesting. This is like a huge, huge topic. But even if you talk to, you know, people in the field of archaeology, I think they often feel like people are really kind of dismissive of how difficult some of the things that look so like, you know, low tech to us, like those are real achievements. Archaeologists don't tend to think of like ancient humans as any stupider than us, you know, if anything, the opposite. They had to be a lot more resourceful. And what's really interesting, you know, there's a lot of kind of interest in things like language, like when did language evolve? You know, what kind of language did Neanderthals speak? Because we have indications that they may have done things like, you know, cave drawings. There are cave drawings that we're not sure are not Neanderthal or that are suspected of being drawn by Neanderthals. So like clearly there's like symbolic representation happening. There's also theories that might have kind of gone from, modern human populations that encountered Neanderthal populations, might have inspired that in them, or, it's not clear. There's a lot that's unclear that's becoming more clear like these days. It's really exciting time to think about those things. But I actually illustrated something where Neanderthals were described as kind of being more simple in their thinking, because that's kind of very much like the trope of Neanderthals, like that the way Neanderthal is used in just like common language. And David Gochman, I told him about this, and he was so offended, like that anyone would think that a Neanderthal is like not this incredibly intelligent being. And yeah, so I think it's really important. And also, especially these days with so many kind of ancient DNA testing and all of that kind of thing happening, these like people who are learning about ancestry are also sometimes learning that, if you're of European descent, you likely have Neanderthal, or you're more likely to have Neanderthal genes. And in Asia, you'll be more likely to have either both or some Denisovan DNA. When you're thinking about those populations that really did like intermix, like how can you imagine them as being something that's not really like a part of you? Like it's kind of, I don't know. I think it's really kind of important to think about them as part of our story, because we know that there was not only this interbreeding, but just like this, especially like in some locations, there really was sharing of space, and probably. So yeah, I don't know. I just think it's like, it's so close to us that it's really hard to kind of like just dismiss it as this ancient thing that lived a long time ago.
I think that's one of the challenges, like when we're talking about, descent through time, right? Like life is a continuum. Like all of us are descendant of all these other millions of years worth of millions of years worth of life and evolution and experiments. And so we have to think of things as like, it's a continuous line. It's like, we're not compartmentalized as Homo sapien and everything is here. There's a transition, and it's all so complex. Like we have to remember that we're all connected to that in the great circle of life kind of thing.
Yeah, I also think it's really nice in the sense that like if anyone, has this thought that these things aren't important, it's like, no, like look at your DNA test. Like that's not the case, like that's very small and then it's a murky thing kind of but yeah, I think it's pretty clear that whatever the species, like in a lot of ways, like ancient humans, had to be so much more resourceful, like so much more knowledgeable. We know a lot of things, like we know that there were attempts at plant treatments. We know that Neanderthals buried their dead. We know a lot of things. They were also cannibalistic, probably. There's a lot of kind of strange things, but there's definitely like complexity.
We're getting close to the end of the show really quick. So I was going to ask for you, as someone who's done both the science and the science illustration part of it, like how do you navigate? Do you choose your projects, or do people come to you?
Well, people do come to me, and this is the life of a freelancer, right? So if I'm too busy, I can pass on a job. If I don't have that luxury, then then I'll do the job even if I'm busy. But I don't get to choose exactly kind of what comes my way. But I do think, highlighting the type of work that I want to do helps find more of that work, if that makes sense. But more than anything else, clients who I have a good relationship with will recommend me to other people in their field. So I tend to do a lot of kind of, biomedical engineering kind of, I did quite a bit of work on artificial intelligence, so those types of things kind of branch off into different things. And I'm what you'd call, I'm not only a paleoartist, I'm much more a generalist. So I do a lot of different types of illustration, which I enjoy. But this type of work has kind of a special place in my heart, and I really want to do more of it. And these types of long drawn out projects are not as common as these kind of fast turnaround things that need to kind of happen quickly. So I guess I don't get to pick and choose all the time, but a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I mean, considering you've done some really great work, I'm hoping that folks here are going to see like, hey, let's get Maayan some some work out
Yes.
there.
Any paleoanthropology work that anyone's interested in, I'd be super excited to do. Yeah.
Sorry, random. Do you have a cat?
Oh, there is a cat here. Yes,
Okay,
I
okay.
apologize.
No.
He really wants to come in, and I'm not letting him. There's actually
Oh.
two. I'm not but one of them is loud, and the other one's not. Sorry.
Okay. No, it's not.
What is that noise? No,
I was
it's
like,
not it's the cat. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay.
Yes, there's a cat here. Full disclosure.
I was like, oh man,
outside the
there's some weird background I'm picking up. What is that?
The fear, I would have let him in and just like he could sit on me, but the fear is he'd walk on the on the keyboard, and that would not
blow up
end
the
well,
computer, turn off the stream.
Yeah.
That's okay. As soon as the cat comes on screen, we
Yeah.
can spike in viewership right there.
We're
The
like,
tail comes up. Yep.
Cats.
Yes. There is a cat. Yeah.
Okay, so last question that we like to ask everybody: what is one piece of advice you'd like to give to like a future science illustrator or someone interested in like getting into this field?
A lot of people come to science illustration from kind of different angles. A lot of people don't go through formal training. It's not necessary to do a formal training, unlike medical illustration, which really does require formal training. And a lot of people come to it from the bench, people who are working as scientists or are, grad students and just keep getting asked to make figures for the papers in their lab or something like that. And they kind of find themselves doing that and enjoying it. So people get into it kind of from all different fields. But I would say knowledge of science tends to be important, right? You need to be able to either, if you're really into art and you're just interested in science, that's fine, but you need to be able to kind of put whatever the science is ahead of what you feel like drawing. So if you're that person, that's kind of something that's worth knowing. Like you need to be able to do that, that it's not your own piece, but if you're doing science illustration in this particular case, you need to be able to kind of put aside what would look best or what you think would look best and kind of go for what is necessary for that communication aspect. And I would just definitely say like, whatever it is that you're interested in might need to be illustrated. Like if you're interested in glaciers, there's illustration work in almost every field of science. And it's actually become a much more viable career path than when I started. And that's thanks to COVID, unfortunately. But COVID really did change the landscape for science illustration. And I think it's a much more viable career than it once was. There's a lot more jobs. There's a lot more freelance work. There's a lot more awareness of its importance. Nothing like trying to convince, the whole world to get vaccinated than needing some good science communication and science art. I think there's a lot of ways to kind of get into it. And there's a lot of like websites and resources and things that can be very, very helpful in figuring out if you want to go to school for it, if you want to kind of try and sort of get into it in a less traditional way. I think just knowing that it exists and knowing that there are kind of ways to find that information.
Awesome.
There's some very useful resources. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
If
folks want to like learn more about your work or kind of get connected with you, where's the best place for them to go?
I am I have a website that has a little bit of blog kind of blog posts on it. So that's kind of helpful if you want to learn about things I'm doing. I'm also on Instagram and on Twitter at Maayan Visuals. I'm probably most active on those two. I think the links are in the notes, but yeah, Instagram, Twitter, email. Yeah, I'm around.
Old school.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll make sure to put those links in the description below. Thank you so much again for joining us today. This was a great talk, and I learned a lot as always.
Yep.
Thank you so much. I was really excited to get to do this. So thank you.
As always, if you all love Fossil Friday chats and want to support programs like it at the Alf Museum and the Western Science Center, you can find links on how to do that in the description below. And make sure you like and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the world of paleontology. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon.